Okay, good evening, everyone. So, this week's Torah reading um, is, is a big improvement over last week's Torah reading. I mean, in terms of just all the stuff about the negaim, all of the ailments, and all of that. I mean, it's just like difficult. But the first part of this week's Torah reading, it's a double parsha. It's a beautiful, beautiful double parsha, and not that long. But the first part, which I think I talked about last year, is all about the special avodah for Yom Kippur, and in its own way, it's very, very beautiful. But when you get to chapter 17, which is most of the way through the first of the two parshiot, of the two sections we're going to read, you get to a brand new part of Sefer Vayikra. And I don't want to insult any parts of the book of Leviticus, but it's hard to follow a lot of the material in the earlier part of the book. It has to do with even the material about Yom Kippur at the beginning of this week's Torah reading, which is beautiful material, and some of the lines remind us of the services on Yom Kippur, and all of that is wonderful. But all of this material about the temple and the avodah, the divine service in the temple, and then of course the last week with the different nigaim, the different ailments that can come to people and to clothing and to houses. It's so alien to us. But then when you get to chapter 17, and from chapter 17 through chapter 23. So we've got six chapters in a row that are all about that the Jewish nation should be holy. And I hate to quote from the Bible critics from the 19th century, but I think they gave a beautiful name to this section of the book of Vayikra. They called it the Holiness Code. And it's really a nice name for these six chapters. They actually extend it further beyond these six. I'm not sure why. And they make claims about when it was written. And I'm not interested in any of their historical analysis. But the truth is, there is a beauty to the fact that we're going through six chapters of material telling the Jewish people how important it is to be Am HaKadosh, the holy people. And it really begins with this statement, which is the third verse in chapter 17. And it says, K'ma'aseh Eretz Mitzrayim, asher yashavtem ba. And all of the practices, all of the behavior patterns of the land of Egypt, where you used to live, lo ta'asu, don't do them. I know the translation here, which comes from the Jewish Publication Society, says do not copy them. But the Hebrew really says don't do them. Just don't act like the Egyptians act. Uma'aseh Eretz Canaan. And that country, Canaan, that we call Eretz Yisrael, that you're going to be going to, Asher ani mevi etchem sham, that I'm going to bring you there. Lo tasu, don't act like them either. Ubechukotehem lo telechu, you shall not follow any of their chukim. Now the translation here says laws, but chukim, and we're going to spend a lot of time on this in about 20 minutes. We'll get back to this idea. A chok means a law that you don't understand. Now, there are a lot of behaviors that countries do, and it makes sense. And there are certain other things that countries do that don't make any sense, that are just, they decided this is a nice thing to do, but it's got no logic necessarily to it. So any customs that don't have a logical basis to them, ignore them. You don't have to, look like them. You don't have to act like them. Don't follow any of their religious practices for sure, and definitely stay away from any of their superstitions. I'm starting to laugh when I say that because it seems like so many things that Jews claim are Jewish customs. A lot of them were superstitions we took from from whomever, whether it was the Lithuanians or the Poles, and just like the foods we eat, we say, oh, this is Jewish food. But of course, it was, Polish or Russian or Lithuanian, depending upon where the family came from. But we're supposed to do our best to not copy their unreasonable behavior. So we have to talk about what things shouldn't we do and what things can we do. And let's begin with Rashi. Rashi says, this tells us that the deeds of the Egyptians and the Canaanites were more corrupt than those of all other nations. Okay, I don't think it's true. I don't think that's the point of the verse. I mean, Rashi is making this point because those two countries were specified, but I'm not sure that it's necessarily. And then he says, and not only were Egypt and Canaan bad places, but the places we lived in Egypt, where the Israelites had resided, was even more corrupt than the rest of Egypt. You lived in terrible sections of Egypt, nor walk in their ordinances. That means their customs, their chukim, their laws that don't have any logical basis to them. And we'll talk about the differences in a few minutes. But by these latter words, it refers to their social customs, things which have assumed for them the character of a law, as, for instance, the frequenting of theaters and race courses. Now, he's quoting a Gemara, but there were no theaters and there were no race courses in Egypt. The theaters, the teatrot, and the race courses, the kirkasot, that the Gemara talks about, that Rashi quotes, that was talking about Rome. Rome had the theaters and the circuses or the racetracks. And that's what so the Midrash sort of like got a little bit confused historically about the things that were going on. Rabbi Meir, however, said, these refer to the ways of the Amorites, which our rabbis have enumerated. So there's two different ideas at the end of this Rashi that we're going to focus on a lot more carefully in 15 or 20 minutes. But the difference, customs means things that people do that aren't necessarily evil in and of themselves, but because the local people do them, and so maybe we can do them and maybe we can't. It's not so clear. Those things we're going to discuss. The way they dress or the kinds of foods they eat. Is it okay? Probably. But some people are going to say we shouldn't do anything like the people we live on. But the second part, what's called Darkei HaEmori, that means either superstitions or it actually means idolatrous practices. The Derech Emori are really what we believe to be negative things that we should stay away from because the Amorites worshipped idolatry. The first one are social things, maybe yes, maybe not. We'll talk about that. But the second area, stay away from their idolatrous practices and their nonsensical superstitions. In other words, look, thank God, I think that worrying about a black cat is ridiculous, and I don't think about it because I live in Jerusalem. There are a lot of black cats crossing my path every day. I mean, if I really believed that was an issue, I mean, I'd have to change my direction. I'd never get to any place all the time. But some things make sense. I mean, don't walk under any ladders. That is stupid. I mean, someone could drop a bucket on your head or paint. I mean, there are things that make sense. There are things that are ridiculous. I remember when I was a kid, we didn't We didn't step on the cracks on the sidewalk. I mean, some things are just ridiculous. And we should not, that's derech emori, those things avoid. Whether they're idolatrous or just foolish, avoid them. The Ramban commenting on this. And he starts by quoting the Ibn Ezra, then he's going to give his own opinion. According to the Ibn Ezra, the scriptural command after the doings of the land of Egypt shall ye not do is a reference to the practice of sacrificing to demons mentioned above in 17:7. We used to send a sa'ir la'azazel. The sa'ir is a goat, and it apparently was supposed to, according to the Ibn Ezra and certain other authorities, I don't think is necessarily true, but that goat represented certain idolatrous practices, and we are sending it away. We're getting rid of those practices and throwing it over a cliff in the desert. We stay away from a lot of those things. So that's about Egypt. And the doings of the land in Canaan shall you not do as an allusion to the forbidden sexual relationships in which the Canaanites were very bad and sinful, as he stated at the end of the section. For all these abominations have the men of the land done. Okay, before we go on in the Ramban, I'm going to slightly disagree with the Ibn Ezra. Historically, Egypt was a land of what we considered to be horrible sexual practices. The pharaohs of Egypt were required by law to marry their sisters. So all sorts of incest, and which we know, genetically is very dangerous, was practiced in Egypt. And so a lot of commentaries, some of them more historical, some also traditional, say that when it says stay away from the practices of Egypt, that meant sexual crimes. And when it said stay away from the practices of Canaan, Canaan was known as a place with a tremendous amount of idolatry. The reason for that was that our little land here, our little piece of land between Egypt and Syria and Babylon and Assyria, this little land was crossed by so many different civilizations that the number of gods worshipped, pagan gods worshipped in Eretz Yisrael, was amazing. When you go to certain towns like Tel Midras in the Shveilat, certain places where we know there are a lot of businessmen and merchants that traveled around, there were just so many different temples to idolatry. It was like unbelievable, because we as a country here, Eretz Yisrael, was a crossroads. So there were many idolatrous practices here in Eretz Yisrael. And that's why it says, don't be like the Egyptians who did sexual crimes. Don't be like the Canaanites who did idolatrous crimes. Okay. And in the opinion of our rabbis, this is another idea, in the Torah Kohanim, the Egyptians were also addicted to carnality, which again, in all forms of forbidden relationships, especially what today we would refer to as incest. This is the truth, as scripture states, that there were also sodomites in the land, referring to the abominations of the nations, which were there from the beginning till now. Scripture further testifies concerning them, the Egyptians, thy neighbors, great of flesh. And it further says, whose flesh is as the flesh of donkeys, and whose issue is like the issue of horses. The term flesh being a euphemism for sexual innuendo. Similarly, in the expressions, his flesh ran with his issue, and her issue in her flesh be blood, that is an allusion to the sexual organ. It's also an allusion to incest, that there was a mixing of the gene pool that ended up being very bad for the leadership cadre of Egypt. The Chizkuni. Rabbi Yossi HaGlili raised the point that seeing the Torah had compared the cultures of Egypt to that of the Canaanites, and that of the Canaanites, they have the Egyptians, why were we commanded to wipe out the Canaanites and to replace them in their former homeland, while the Torah did not command us to destroy the Egyptians? I mean, we just left Egypt. I mean, I know the plagues and the crossing the Red Sea did kill a lot of Egyptians, but we had no obligation to do anything nasty to them. The Canaanites were granted to live on the land for 47 years longer than it took God to punish the Egyptians. As we know that Hebron was founded 7 years earlier than its counterpart, so on in Egypt. So in other words, Canaan was there before Egypt, and it lasted later. The answer to this question is that they had the merit of burying Abraham in the cave of the Machpelah going for them. So in other words, God destroys Egypt. We have to kill the Canaanites, but we allow them to live for quite a while with us because they received some merit. Because not only did they bury Abraham, Abraham was recognized by them as a great man. We see that from many verses towards the beginning of the book of Breshit, that everywhere Avraham went, he was treated with tremendous respect. This was less true of Yitzchak and Yaakov, but of Avraham, there was a lot of kavod, a lot of respect for Avraham from the people living in then called Canaan. Okay, a more modern approach. David Tzvi Hoffman, who wrote his famous commentary in the book of Vayikra in the 1890s, almost at the beginning of the 20th century, he said, first of all, we are warned that the behavior of Egypt, the actions themselves are not listed because they are well known. Their behavior is of the lowest possible level, which brings them to the level of animals or worse. Also, the land of Canaan is full of depravity, as many texts bear witness. Nor shall you follow the chukim. These are the rules and customs which have the authority of law. Chukim, customs that don't necessarily have any logical basis to them, but become part of the legal system of the country. For example, the holidays established for their gods, which are full of depravity and licentiousness. According to Tosfot, in this law are two types, chukim, which are customs connected to idolatry, and two, actions which have no basis in logic and their source is in superstition. These activities are referred to as darkei ha'emori, which are just illogical and have no basis in reason or common sense. I want to make one more comment before we go on, because those are the four people that really talk about Egypt and Canaan. It'll be mentioned later, but there's not so much this dichotomy of explaining them. I think one of the ways to read the verse that is very reasonable is Egypt and Canaan are just examples. The Jewish people, as we sadly know, have been the world's wanderers for millennia. And we can interpret this verse to not just mean, oh, those terrible Egyptians, oh, those terrible Canaanites. It means when you travel the world from community to community, don't get emotionally and intellectually attached to the customs of the place you were just in, and don't automatically pick up the customs and the different ways of life in the place that you're coming to. Use your mind. Think carefully about what kinds of behavior make sense and which are foolish or perhaps even destructive. And Egypt and Canaan can be seen just as the first two stopping places for the Jewish nation. From Canaan, next is Assyria. And then after Assyria is Babylonia. After Babylonia is Persia. And after Persia is Greece. And after Greece is Rome. And then we start going to North Africa. And then we go into Europe. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And I think a simple and I think reasonable reading of the verse is, don't get attached to the behavior patterns of where you were and of where you are arriving. Whether that's England, the United States, France, Germany, Russia, Lithuania, Ukraine, and it goes on and on and on. And I think one simple reading of it is not that they were special, those are just the first two of our many stopovers in Jewish history. Bottom of the first page, Or HaChaim. In view of the fact that the entire chapter deals only with regulations about forbidden sexual unions. Now, our chapter 17, emphasizes that. That's going to change in the second reading that we're going to be reading this week, Kedoshim, that talks about a lot of interhuman personal relationships. But the beginning of the holiness section, holiness code, is about sexual immorality. What does the Torah mean by referring to my statutes and my ordinances? Besides, what does the Torah mean to walk in them? We're going to be told, telehu, walk in the ways of God. We may explain this in connection with thinking about the subject of sex increases one's lust at the expense of the ability to dominate one's decision-making process. So before we start to tell you the reasonable way to behave, we say, and you know what? Try to control your sexual lust. That's the beginning, because once you've got that under control, then you can look at the rest of life with more reason, with more calmness in your decision-making process, rather than allowing your lusts to control yourself. The Torah was afraid to tell us to distance ourselves from the subject of sex. Absolutely. We never said anything like was said in the Catholic Church or other religions about that celibacy is a good thing. Become a priest or a nun and you're married to God. We were always against that kind of absolute sexual abstinency. Why? In order that we would not refrain from fulfilling the commandment, the first commandment, to be fruitful and to multiply. We're supposed to have children and grandchildren. That's the greatest nachas. That's the greatest contribution we make. So in other words, we're telling you, be careful, control it, but God forbid, don't eliminate it. Please, don't make that mistake. And other related commandments. Taking the warnings of the Torah too much to heart would result in something counterproductive to God's statutes and ordinances, God's plan for the world. Therefore, the Torah introduced the subject by first repeating the need to carry out God's ordinances. Et mishpatai tasu, do my instructions. Follow my laws. Yes, be careful in your sexual behavior, but don't eliminate it. God forbid. And that's referring to the commandment to be fruitful and to multiply. Before warning us to observe the prohibitions about to be legislated in that context, that chukotai tishmaro, keep all of my ordinances. Therefore, God had to tell us to walk in his ordinances, that is, to perform the basic commandment of procreation, populating the earth, etc., etc. And he doesn't mention nachas, but he could have mentioned nachas. I mean, that's the greatest nachas, right? Is the children and the grandchildren. That's what it's all about. So it's so careful. Yes, be, control, but don't totally abstain. We are totally against that idea. Okay. The Sfat Emet, commenting on the same area of rules. In the verse, like the practice of the land of Egypt, my judgments to walk in them, all of these very strict statements about don't be like them, listen to Hashem. Rashi explains, You are not permitted to be exempt from them, as it's written, like the practice, not actually the practice of the land of Egypt, because the Bnei Yisrael were already a holy congregation. And what is the relevance to warn them from acting like these sinners? I mean, we don't want to be like them. We saw how terrible they are. We just got the Torah. We want to be good guys. But the explanation is that there should not be any act of a Jew that is like / similar to the acts of the wicked, that all their acts are for worldliness alone. Rather, the Bnei Israel need to sanctify all their actions, to cleave to the source of the life force, and to take from it life force. Stay connected to Hashem. All of our actions should be in keeping with what it is that Hashem wants from us. Now, we're now going to take a look at two relatively recent. I mean, Hirsch, of course, was the end of the 1800s, but and we have to see how we should be taking these ideas and rules and strictures and applying them in our own lives. So Reb Aaron Lichtenstein, who of course was the Rosh Yeshiva in Yeshivat Har Etzion for many years, he made Aliyah in 1969, and he passed away, I think, in 2010. I think it was approximately. So he was the Rosh Yeshiva there for decades, and he's talking about, again, what things can't you do and what things should you do. What is the meaning of the repetition in this verse? What is the phrase, nor shall you follow their statutes? We already said don't act like them. So why did it add their chukim? What does that add to the first part of the command, that we're not supposed to be like them? In the following verse we read, you shall perform my judgments, capital M, God's halachot, God's judgments and laws, and observe my statutes, chukim, laws that you don't understand, like keeping kosher. Now, you have to follow my laws you do understand, judgments, and the laws that I give you that you don't understand, like keeping kosher, which we did 2 weeks ago. The term judgments, mishpatim, refers to those commandments whose reasons are clear, those which, had they not been uttered by God, they would be worthy of being enacted by man. Most famous is, don't steal, don't kill. You should have laws that make society, run in an orderly way. Statutes, on the other hand, chukim, were translated as statutes, but it means laws we don't understand. On the other hand, are commandments whose reasons are unknown to us. Those which, from our point of view, appear arbitrary. I mean, why did God say, we can eat a cow, but we can't eat a pig? I mean, I know we gave rules about how to recognize, the differences in species, but why is one species better? Gesundheit. Why is one species better than another? I mean, we don't know. What's the reason for it? There is nothing inherently negative about the prohibited activity itself, or there's nothing that, we know a lot of, Gentiles that eat pork and, bacon and all, that seem perfectly healthy and fine. So there's nothing inherently negative about it. But when the Torah speaks of their statutes, it refers to ordinary actions that are not in themselves negative. Just as from our point of view, there is no moral imperative to such laws as kilayim. Kilayim, which he says the prohibition of mixing species, there are two different types of kilayim. The most famous kilayim is we shouldn't make a garment that it's a mixture of linen and wool. And it's interesting that in early America, in like revolutionary America, in the 1700s up to probably the Civil War. I don't know if this is true in England, but it's true in America. There was a very strong fabric called homespun. Homespun had the, I don't remember which is the whoop and which is the woof. Woof and whoop. One goes up and down and one goes side. Well, one of the, whatever ones they were, I don't remember which is which. But in one direction was linen, and in the other direction was wool. And that was a very strong cloth. And in America, it was called homespun. It was actually had another name, Lindsay Woolsey, which really described the fact that it's shotness. It's like, that's what's usher for us to wear. So we don't know why. There was nothing inherently wrong with wearing this very strong fiber, because it took the advantage of the different strengths of this fiber from plants and this other fiber from animals, and it was a very successful and very popular, at least in America, material for clothing. Or the purification procedure involved with the red heifer, which of course we don't have anymore. But that meant that if I touch something that's impure, I go to a funeral. I'm in the same building with someone who has passed away, with a body. Then I have to go to the Kohen Gadol, go to the Kohen and get sprinkled with the red heifer, and I'm impure for 7 days, and then I become pure. Now we don't have that anymore. But again, there's nothing inherent in it. It's a chok. We don't understand why. Why then are these Gentile customs forbidden? I mean, we have our own chukim. So why do we say, but you can't follow theirs? The Torah does not want us to imitate the Gentiles and their culture. We are not commanded, you shall not perform their statutes. Yes, you can listen to their laws. If they have a law, a copyright law, or a law that you shouldn't litter, those are good laws. You can listen to those. Those are statutes. But rather, you shall not follow their statutes. You can follow their laws, but you can't follow their chukim. There is nothing wrong with the actions themselves. The problem is the very imitation of Gentile ways and adoption of their culture. And the person that I think for most modern Orthodox, or I don't know if that's the right term, or Zionist Orthodox, people that that we tend to incorporate some of the modern world in our behavior. The person that we're following to a great extent is Rabbi Hirsch. And so Rabbi Hirsch is going to give his gloss on the material we've been talking about as what things can we follow from the Gentiles. Now, everyone should be aware that Rabbi Hirsch died in 1880, and he lived in Germany, and he was living in the Germany that was very accepting of Jews at that time, and that acceptance of German customs, dress, behavior was very popular in that Hirschian community in Frankfurt am Main. Okay, so he says you may imitate the nations among whom you live in everything which has been adapted or adopted by them on rational grounds. In other words, okay, there's there's a custom that the fire trucks make a certain noise when they go by. That's a great idea. So you know that there's a fire truck going by, right? I mean, even then they had already fire brigades and everything. But do not imitate anything which is irrational or has been adopted on grounds derived from their religion. Oh, but you shouldn't, take off your hat when you go into a house of worship, because they do it. God forbid. Our custom is the opposite. or for forbidden or immoral purposes, which we're not going to go into, but I mean, you understand what we mean. You may not therefore join in celebrating their holy days. No, Xmas is not our holiday, okay? Or observe customs that have their basis, their basis and their religious views. You must not do anything which disturb their holy days, which is very important. That's we don't, we don't disturb their church services. We don't disturb their holidays or mar their festival spirit. You can wish them a happy holiday, okay? And do not parade your non-participation in their holy days in a manner that might arouse animosity. As we should be mention about it. We should be polite about it, but we refrain. Okay? I've already explained the terms pa'al and aseh. Pa'al is an overall action that's a broad description of behavior, and aseh is a specific. Generally describes actions in society, while the verb holech implies personal integrity of action. So we can do things like them, but we can't holech like them. Our society is different, but we do a lot of the same things which have to do with the good running of society, paying taxes, listening to the police. Okay? So too in our verse, the terms ma'aseh of Egypt and Canaan imply societal behavior in how to treat each other, while lelechet in their chukim implies personal behavior. Societal behavior, good. Personal behavior, avoid. Okay? So in other words, Hirsch is agreeing with my explanation of a few minutes ago that Canaan and Egypt are just examples. Now, before we do Rav Moshe, I want to read, and I really should have put it on the page, and I apologize that I didn't. I want to read from the Shulchan Aruch. This is in Yoredeya. Yoredeya are the laws that are more like ritual oriented, and has laws of kashrus as well. But it also has a big section on laws of idolatry and not being like the Gentiles. And it brings up that there is a siman that is shalom lilvosh k'malbushay ovdei kochavim. You shouldn't dress like idolaters. You shouldn't dress like the people who worship idols. Okay. Ein holchim b'chukot ha'ovdei kochavim. You shouldn't walk in the customs of the idolaters. V'lo midamin lahem. Don't be like them. Okay? V'lo yabash malbush hamiyuchad lahem. And don't wear a garment which is specifically for their idolatrous, for their religious performances. V'lo yigadel tzitzat rosho k'mot tzitzat rosham. And don't grow your hairstyles to look like them. Now, the idea of tzitz, he sounds like he's talking about payas because it means pieces that come off. But what he was really talking about is that it became popular amongst church people in Europe to have the tonsure, the bald spot. I mean, I have a bald spot, but that's just I have a bald spot. But they used to, like cut their hair, and it was just like around the head like that. V'lo yigaleach mehat stadim, and don't cut off the sides of your beard like they do. Now, we're supposed to have, payot, okay? V'yaniach hasa'ar be'emsa, v'lo yigaleach hasa'ar l'cheneged panav me'ozen la'ozen, and you shouldn't cut the hair from ear to ear. So you have to keep the way we cut our hair, not the way they do it, okay? V'lo yibane mekomo. We shouldn't build our buildings k'binyan hechalot shel avodat kochavim. We shouldn't build our buildings, whether it's a shul or a place of business or a home, like they build their churches. Now, I don't know how many people have looked at the architecture of churches. They tend to form a crucifix, an X. There is a long nave, and then there are two apses on the side. So we're not supposed to build that building. So they also form an X if you would look at it across, if you looked at it from the ear. Okay. And that is the Mechaber, that is Rabbi Yosef Karo. He wrote that in 1554. Now, the footnote is from Reb Moshe Islis that I'm going to read to you now. And this was written in 1572 in Poland. This is Minhag Ashkenaz, as opposed to the Mechaber who wrote in Eretz Yisrael and gave the Sephardi customs. Haggah. V'lo yehem muvdal mehem b'malbusha, but you don't have to dress differently than them. Ubisham ma'asav, and from other actions that they might do. You don't have to go out of your way to be different for the sake of being different. The cause eno asor el bedavar shenogu bo ha'ovdei kochavim l'shem pritzut. The only things you have to worry about and stay away from are things that they do either because of idolatry, avodah zarah, which means Christianity, okay, and pritzut, that means sexual impropriety. Kigon shenogin labosh malbushin adumim v'hu malbush sam. We shouldn't wear the red garments that their officers wear, or malbushi hapritzot, or clothes that are worn that are not tsanua, that are not modest. And all of that, you should stay away from them. Okay, and you have to stay away from anything that might be a darche emuri. So what is a darche emori? The ways of the Amorites, sheyesh bo shemetz avodah zara me'avoteim, which may have a little bit of idolatry in it from the past. Might be, sometimes they have certain customs, may have to do with things like an Xmas tree and things like that, that may have had some idolatrous background to it. Stay away from that. But things that they do for a good purpose, kigon, for example, they have a custom that every doctor who is an expert, yeshlo malbush miyuchad, he's supposed to wear a special garment so everyone that everybody knows is a doctor. Mutar, it's permitted. That's fine. Little bosh v'kain chosen mishum kavod otam acher mutar, or things that were done just out of respect, and those things are permitted and they're a good idea, and you should do them. Especially things like following traffic laws and safety regulations. All of those things, 100%. Based on this idea, now please. Back in the sheet, the last thing at the next to last thing at the bottom, Reb Moshe Feinstein said, and he wrote this in 1953, there is no necessity to wear clothing different from the Gentiles. We can wear a suit and a tie. Women can wear the same dresses that the Gentile women are wearing, unless their dress is immodest. I mean, if it doesn't follow our laws of tzniut, of modesty, then that, otherwise it's perfectly okay to dress like them. Means you can wear a tie, you can wear a sports jacket or a tuxedo. All that is okay. Or meant to engender pride. And might be that certain things that they wear because it shows that they're better than somebody else, maybe those things you should avoid. And as a result, Jews have a custom to dress differently. And so there were places where the Jews had a custom to look differently, because there were places where the Gentiles didn't dress in a modest way, and they had specific reasons for the dress that we wanted to avoid. Only then would there be a prohibition. But normally we can look like them. We can go to the same stores they go to. All of that is fine. And that's the way most of us have behaved throughout our lives, and all of this is absolutely fine. At the bottom of the page, I put a line, and it's sort of like asking a question that seems like it might have been almost an argument between Yeshayahu the prophet, Isaiah the prophet, and Herzl and Herzl, the founder of what we call modern Zionism, as it's called. And he wrote that his dream for the Medina, for Eretz Israel, was that it should be a state like all states. But the famous prophecy of Isaiah about the future of the Jewish people is that you should be a light unto the nations. The question is, do they conflict? And the answer is sometimes, but usually not. And there are few customs that there are tremendous arguments about, that should we do things that aren't prohibited, but they're copied from the Goyim. One of the most famous of the arguments here in modern Israel is about the siren on Yom HaZikaron and on Yom HaShoah. Should we follow this idea of standing at attention and standing quietly for 2 minutes, or 1 minute, depending on which siren it is, to show our respect? And so we know that there are Haredim, there are ultra-Orthodox in our country that go out of their way to flout this law. Well, we know most of us go out of our way to make sure. I mean, Rivka and I go outside to be on the street, to stand at attention, to remember either the Kedoshim, the holy sacrifices from the Holocaust, or from the wars of Israel. And we'd like to be outside. Now, unfortunately, in our neighborhood, we're very close to an Arab area, so there are Arabs zooming by on. But a lot of the cars pull over, and a lot of all the people on the sidewalks stand still. We don't have many Haredim, but we've all seen films of Haredim. So, is there a problem with this? And I want to say very strongly that I don't think there's a problem. And it seems like when you look at the halacha, that we are permitted to do things that the world recognizes as a sign of respect, not because it has anything to do with idolatry or superstition, but because it's just something that people have decided shows respect and honor. And for that reason, most of us do dress like the rest of the people in the world, because that's what the Shulchan Aruch says is permitted. And we have to make a fine line and draw that fine line. What are the things that we say, that's not for me? And what are the things that, oh, that makes sense. I can learn from that. I can grow from that idea and then follow it. And I hope that that all of us use something that isn't very common, which is, of course, common sense, in how we apply these rules to our own life. And I feel very strongly that that Herzl's dream and Yeshayahu's prophecy can really be combined here in Medinat Israel, here in our beloved state of Israel. And I think when we read these parshiot, which are about behave yourselves in sexual ways, be kind to your neighbors, be kind to strangers, to help people who need help. All of the rules that are in these 6 chapters of Kedusha, of holiness, all of those are about having a wonderful society. And all of those can be combined in our Medina for making this both a state like all states, because it has rules and laws and has, safety regulations and streets and subways and all the things that countries have. But still, because we follow the rules in these 6 chapters here in the middle of the book of Leviticus, we're still a light unto the nations. We can be like a regular nation and still show the world how ethical, moral, and really how good we are, both in our relationship with Hashem and our relationship with the rest of the world. And I just hope that we continue to make sure that we're concerned for both being members of the modern world while simultaneously sanctifying ourselves to Darkei Hashem, to the ways of God and the Torah. Okay, thank you very much for joining this evening. And there's a lot to learn from these chapters without having to say, oh, I have to live as if it's still the 16th century.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Have a great evening, everyone.
You too.